My intention, as stated in a previous video, was to make this series focused on English translations of Sanskrit terms because I felt and believe that the English translations would have teaching value in terms of particularly getting a better handle on what the ideals are associated with the Bodhisattva and with the Buddha. But I'm gonna kind of do a reverse gear on the beginning of this video by saying that there's a term in the BDK Lotus Sutra in English which I think is also worth knowing in the Sanskrit, because in some or many other translations you do see this Sanskrit term, and I think it's worth knowing and hearing a few comments about it. And that term is, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but the term is Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi. And with this video focused on chapters 3 and 4 of the Lotus Sutra, at the very beginning of chapter 3 there's reference to the fact that what the Buddha is preaching, in effect, in the Lotus Sutra is regarding the what is referred to as the achievement of Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi, which again is translated in the English as highest perfect enlightenment. And the point being made here in chapter 3 is that it's through this so-called greater vehicle that this highest perfect enlightenment can be, quote, achieved. Well, it raises an interesting question as to what is achieved. And is there such thing as a higher versus a lower, a greater vehicle versus a lesser vehicle? Or are all these teachings provisional means, skillful means? That's one point. But the more fundamental point is related to the notion that I've been reading about lately in an article by Jacqueline Stone, and I'll reference the article in the description of this video, pertaining to the notion of original enlightenment. And as I understand it, the term original enlightenment was first seen in the Awakening of Faith Shastra, or commentary, which is a wonderful Mahayana scripture. It's not a sutra, I don't think, but it is a scripture. And it was written back around the time that the other Mahayana sutras were written, I believe, around 100 AD, by a Yogacaran Mahayana Buddhist, and tries to explicate in less poetic, less fanciful terms a description of the nature of enlightenment. And in there again is reference to this notion of original enlightenment. And according to Jacqueline Stone and others that I've read, this notion sort of blossomed, if you will, with the Lotus Flower Sutra and the Tendai school, originally the Tentai school in China, evolving into the Tendai school in Japan. And there was a lot of focus on it, particularly in medieval Japan, between like the 11th and 14th centuries. Well, what is this notion? You know, it's related to the notion that as we see in some of the Mahayana sutras, to the effect that samsara is nirvana and nirvana is samsara. If samsara is nirvana and nirvana is samsara, in other words, if the world of suffering is the world of the Pure Land, and vice versa, in other words, what we would have then is a kind of radical non-dualism. In other words, that if we say that the nature of reality is such that it can't be broken down into this versus that, well, then how do we conceive of the notion that there is a state of enlightenment versus a state of non-enlightenment? And is there an identity, in a sense, between these two states, conditions, experiences, whatever, however you want to think about them. And, following on that logic, that if there's no difference between enlightenment and non-enlightenment, then, one of the concerns that some folks had back in the day in medieval Japan was, well then, is there no practice that's necessary? And if no practice is necessary, does that then lead to the potential for non-action in the face of societal conditions that are antithetical to a humanistic perspective? Does it lead to some of the kinds of moral degradation that could be associated with a feeling that no practice is necessary? I don't have sophisticated knowledge about these matters. I'm basically a layperson and a devotee of a Pure Land sect, namely Jodoshinshu. Namo Mita Botso. Namo Mita Botso. Namo Mita Botso. Both Honen, who founded the Pure Land School, and Shinran, who later refined it, emerged from the tradition of the Tendai school on Mount Hai, and were deeply immersed, no doubt, in this original enlightenment, or Hongaku, kind of perception or way of experiencing and perceiving the nature of reality. In her article, Jacqueline Stone really hones in on these so-called new Kamakura schools of Buddhism and puts forward ideas and theories on their relationship to the teachings of original enlightenment. And one of those theories or perspectives or ideas is that the Tendai school, in a sense, was the womb or spawned these new schools of Buddhism, such as Pure Land and Zen and Nichirenism. Another theory is that these newer schools represented a rejection of that notion of original enlightenment or Hongaku, and re-emphasized the notion of practice. Whatever the case may be in that regard, if we truly want to look at what is the nature of fundamental reality, we have to acknowledge its non-dual nature. Clearly, I have a sectarian bias in that regard, and that I think that Shinran Shonin, he found the right recipe, if you will, the right formula, in the sense that he pointed followers to the larger Sukhavati or Pure Land Sutra, where Dharmakara makes his wonderful vows, the 18th of which is to essentially assure anyone who says his name and has faith in him that they will be reborn in his Pure Land when they die. This sounds dualistic, but what Shinran, in a sense, brilliantly did was to articulate a framework that transcended notions of good and evil, while at the same time not indicating that we are Buddhas in this life now. As a matter of fact, he argued that the nature of our obstacles of greed, hatred, and ignorance are so deep that it's impossible for us to become Buddhas in this life. and that's why we look to become Buddhas when we die and are reborn in Amita's Pure Land. So back to the notion of practice, the concept is that no practice is necessary, but that doesn't either mean that we are perfected as we are, nor does it mean that we can or should ignore ordinary moral behavior. While Shinran emphasized over and over that the vow of Dharmakara is extremely powerful in terms of being able to overcome any evil, he made the point that you don't take a poison just because there's an antidote. So he really developed a system that liberated us from contrivance, from ego, while at the same time providing an acknowledgement of our Buddha nature, which in many ways is the essence of original enlightenment. So one of Shinran's disciples, Yenbo, he wrote a book called the Tanisho, in which he lamented the deviations from Shinran's teaching, and gives a lot of what he claims to have directly heard from Shinran regarding Shinran's teaching. And these differences, I mean, there are some subtle ones and various ones that, are very much worth reading and focusing on, but in gross terms, perhaps the two most polar opposite potential deviations from Shinran's true teaching would be either one, that reliance upon Dharmakara's vow implied license to do evil, or on the other hand, that evil would be an obstruction to the efficacy of Dharmakara's vow. And with regard to the last, I want to end this video by reading the preface to Yenbo's Tanisho, and also the first section, which addresses the issue of whether or not practice is necessary in order to be saved. The author, Yenbo, who was a disciple of Shinran, says, quote, "As I humbly reflect on the past, when the late master Shinran was alive, and the present in my foolish mind, I cannot but lament the divergences from the true Shinjin that he conveyed by speaking to us directly, and I fear there are doubts and confusions in the way followers receive and transmit the teaching. For how is entrance into the single gate of easy practice possible unless we happily come to rely on a true teacher whom conditions bring us to encounter? Let there be not the slightest distortion of the teaching of other power with words of an understanding based only on personal views. Here, then, I set down in small part the words spoken by the late Shinran Shonin that remain deep in my mind, solely to disperse the doubts of fellow practicers." Section 1. And these are purported to be words of Shinran that were heard by the author of the Tanisho, Yenbo. "Saved by the inconceivable working of Amita's vow, I shall realize birth in the Pure Land. The moment you entrust yourself thus to the vow, so that the mind set upon saying the Nembutsu arises within you, you are immediately brought to share in the benefit of being grasped by Amita, never to be abandoned. Know that the primal vow of Amita makes no distinction between people young and old, good and evil. Only Shinjin is essential. For it is the vow to save the person whose karmic evil is deep and grave and whose blind passions abound. Thus, for those who entrust themselves to the primal vow, no good acts are required, because no good surpasses the Nembutsu. Nor need they despair of the evil they commit, for no evil can obstruct the working of Amida's primal vow. Thus were his words. So that reflects Shinran's view on the fact that no practice is necessary, but it's embedded in a framework that mitigates against ego and the negative potential effects of ego if not humbled by a comparison to the virtues of Amida Buddha.